reasonable expectation.
Kevin Haig.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's a pleasure to take my first call on part two, and I want to, I guess, echo some of the comments of praise that others have already made in this debate around some of the provisions of part two. There is no question that the provisions that are set out in part two represent a very substantial step forward, and perhaps in an echo of the comments that I made in respect of part one about the triangle of safety, here in part two we actually see an aspect of that triangle of safety implemented through the reintroduction of check inspectors, meaning that workers and employers and the government are all playing their part in ensuring workplace health and safety. There's no question in my mind that those provisions will result in safer underground mines. So, Mr. Chair, the question then arises about the change that the government has made to the bill to remove tunnelling and quarrying from the full coverage of the Part 2 provisions. Because, Mr. Chair, if those full provisions result in safer underground mines, there's no reason to suppose that they wouldn't also result in safer tunnels and quarries. And, Mr. Chair, the question then is, what ought the trigger factor be to result in those enhanced provisions for workplace health and safety? Because our starting point is we should be doing what we can to make every workplace as safe as it can be. And the rationale that's so far been advanced by the government for excluding tunnels and quarries from those full provisions is that those particular kinds of operation don't pose the same hazard of methane explosions that an underground coal mine does. And, Mr. Chair, I submit to you and to the House that is not an appropriate trigger provision. We believe that perhaps a smarter threshold condition, if we're not going to apply these provisions to all workplaces, would be to, say, take those workplaces that actually contain multiple hazards of serious harm, and that threshold would capture quarries, it would capture tunnels, and it would capture other dangerous workplaces like the forestry industry, for example. So that would seem to me, Mr. Chair, to be a more sensible application of this House's time and this House's decision-making power, that rather than narrowing down those workplaces where we will apply the conditions that make for the greatest safety, we actually should be looking to elaborate and to figure out what other workplaces are like this, in the sense that they actually contain those multiple hazards of serious harm, and applying these provisions to those also. Mr. Chair, that's important because of this document, the report of the Royal Commission on the Pike River disaster, and the evidence that the Royal Commission heard about the kinds of factors that lead to the kinds of incident that occurred in Pike River. The Royal Commission makes it absolutely plain that a methane explosion is just one point in a whole range of things that went wrong in the Pike River mine. And the evidence that the Royal Commission heard from Dr. Kathleen Callaghan, and that I've referred to previously in the House, that set out some of the work of Professor James Reason around human factors behind disasters, behind things going wrong, actually talks about the multiple layers of protection and the Swiss cheese model that says if there are holes in each of these layers, and there will be, Unless they line up, things turn out okay. Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Chair. But in that Swiss cheese model, if those holes do line up, and what Kathleen Callaghan said was in Pike River, there were multiple layers, multiple holes. So, for example, the law itself, the regulations around health and safety, the company's provisions and policies around health and safety, the training for workers in health and safety in that mine, the actual actions of workers, the decisions made by the board of the Pike River Coal Company. Each of those represented a layer that could have provided safety for the workers, that could have eliminated risk, but each of those had holes in it. And what Kathleen Callaghan said is, in this sort of environment where there are complex risks, multiple hazards, that actually it's the alignment of the holes that can't be predicted that represents the serious hazard. And we should be doing all that we can to avoid those. And Mr. Chair, doing all that we can means actually applying that higher level of health and safety protection in all of the workplaces where such hazards exist. So, yep, sure, a quarry doesn't have the same risk of a methane explosion, but it does have, as we heard on the Select Committee, it does have the risk of very serious injuries and death. And it does have those multiple workplace hazards that could be reduced or eliminated, the holes in the Swiss cheese closed by the kinds of provisions that are in Part 2 of this bill. So why on earth shouldn't we apply those same provisions to those other complex and dangerous workplaces in quarries and in tunnels? And Mr. Chair, the fact that the government has chosen not to do that suggests to me that the government has failed to understand that really basic conclusion out of the Pike River Royal Commission. Because what it was saying is this is not just about one thing going wrong. It's about a whole chain of failures at every level. And Mr. Chair, if there's one thing that we should be doing out of that Royal Commission report, it's to actually learn from that, learn from those multiple failures, and to do all that we can to reduce or eliminate those multiple hazards. And quarrying and tunnelling are indeed industries that have those. And as I've said, there are many other industries also. For that reason, Mr. Chair, the Green Party will be supporting Andrew Little's SOP number 388. We believe that the coverage in Part 2 for quarrying and tunnelling should be returned to the bill, because no good reason has been advanced for it not to be. There is a similar exclusion that now applies in Part 3 as a result, or will apply as a result of the Minister's SOP, and I certainly would make the same argument in relation to Part 3, that we should be extending all of the protections that are available in this bill to all of these workplaces, and that means re-inclusion of tunnelling and quarrying alongside underground mining. So, Mr. Chair, Part 2 certainly advances the case of health and safety in parts of the sector, but disappointingly fails to grasp the opportunity that was provided in this bill, fails to honour the promise of honouring the recommendations of the Pike River Royal Commission report. Thank you.
Sue Moroney.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for the opportunity to rise in support of Part 2.